There is a football match that, to this day, makes historians, journalists, and former players avert their eyes whenever someone brings it up. A match that should not have happened the way it did. That could not have ended with that score. And yet it ended. Exactly as it needed to end. Not one goal more. Not one goal less. 6-0. And what lay behind that number, far too perfect to be coincidence, will make you question everything you thought you knew about football and about human nature. We are in 1978. Argentina had just opened its arms to the world with a World Cup that would be, for many, a symbol of national glory. For others, a mask over one of the darkest periods in the country's history. General Jorge Rafael Videla's military regime had been governing the country with an iron fist since the coup of 1976. Thousands of people had disappeared. Trade unions were banned. The press was controlled. And the 1978 World Cup was, according to the generals themselves, the perfect opportunity to show the world a united, prosperous, and powerful Argentina. Football would be the showcase. The players would be the actors. And the Argentine people, both those who cheered in the stands and those who wept in silence in the basements, would be the backdrop. But let us take it slowly. To understand that night of June 21, 1978, you need to understand what was at stake. Not just in sporting terms. Not just in political terms. But in human terms. Because what happened inside the Monumental Stadium in Buenos Aires transcends football and forces us to ask how far a regime will go when it decides it needs a victory at any cost. Argentina had reached the second phase of the 1978 World Cup in Group B of the final stage, which functioned as a league with matches between Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Poland. The results would determine who went to the final. Brazil and Argentina were locked in a tight battle for the top of the group. Brazil had played earlier that same afternoon and defeated Poland 3-1. That result changed everything. Because now, with the tournament's mathematics calculated to the second, it became clear that Argentina needed to beat Peru by 4 goals to overtake Brazil in the table and go through to the final. 4 goals. At minimum. Against a Peruvian side that had reached the second phase and was therefore no ordinary team. Brazil celebrated. The Brazilian players watched Argentina's match convinced that a 4-goal margin was impossible, or at the very least extremely unlikely. The Brazilian national team had won all its games in the second phase. It had beaten Argentina in the head-to-head encounter 2-0 and positioned itself as the natural favorite to reach the final. The mathematics seemed to protect Brazil. The numbers seemed to be the impenetrable wall between Argentina and glory. And then the match began. The opening minutes were tense, as any World Cup game is. Peru took to the field. Goalkeeper Ramon Quiroga took his position. And Argentina began to attack with an intensity few had expected. The first goal came early. The second did too. The Monumental Stadium erupted with each goal as if the 90 minutes were a ceremony confirming a destiny already written. At halftime, Argentina led 4-0. The minimum required. But there were still 45 minutes to play, and Peru could respond at any moment. But Peru did not respond. Peru did not come close to scoring. Peru seemed paralyzed, disoriented, unable to find the path it had found throughout the tournament. And Argentina kept scoring. 5-0. 6-0. The final whistle sounded with a scoreline that seemed to have come from a cold, surgical, almost supernatural calculation. 6-0. 4 goals ahead. Exactly what they needed. Not one more. Not one less. Brazil was eliminated. Argentina went to the final. And the football world began, slowly, to ask itself a question that would never go away. What really happened that night? In the days that followed, the rumors began to multiply. And they were not rumors born of Brazilian resentment, as the Argentine press tried to frame it for years. They were suspicions that came from within, from unexpected sources, from players and officials who chose to remain silent for decades before speaking. The first unsettling element was Peru's own goalkeeper, Ramon Quiroga. He had been born in Argentina. He had grown up in Rosario, the same city that had produced some of the greatest players in Argentine football history. He had been naturalized as Peruvian, but his Argentine origins were a fact that, in that sinister light, took on a different weight. But that alone proved nothing. Goalkeepers born in another country play for their adopted nations all the time. And football is full of coincidences that seem too much to be coincidences but that, in the end, are exactly that. Coincidences. So you could rest in that interpretation and move on. Except that, in the decades that followed, the story began to take on other dimensions. Other details that were impossible to ignore. In 2012, former Argentine Senator Fernando Mila publicly declared that he had heard, from sources within the military regime itself, that the Argentine government had offered Peru an economic aid package and a grain shipment in exchange for a defeat. The quantity of wheat mentioned was 35,000 tons. The credit loan was $50 million. Sums that, in the context of Peru's economic crisis at the time, were significant enough to enter the equation of any political decision. And here the question becomes something else entirely. No longer about football, but about what an authoritarian regime, desperate for international legitimacy, is capable of when it decides the world needs to see its country win. There is also the testimony of Nicanor Gonzalez, a former CIA operative who, in later interviews, stated that the American agency had knowledge of negotiations between the Argentine and Peruvian governments before the match. The Argentine military regime, as is well documented, had close ties with Washington during the Cold War, and Vidila's dictatorship had received both political and financial American support. The idea that the United States might have facilitated or at least tolerated a political arrangement that guaranteed Argentina's victory was not, in the geopolitical context of the time, as far outside the realm of the reasonable as we might wish it were. And then there was Peru's behavior on the pitch that night. Players who had fought with grit throughout the entire tournament seemed, according to reports from the time, to be playing in slow motion. Quiroga, who had been one of the tournament's standout goalkeepers, appeared to be a completely different player in that match. There is not a single play, a single save, a single moment of brilliance that might suggest he was performing at the limits of his ability. On the contrary, there are images, there are moments that remain as silent witnesses to something that cannot easily be named but that cannot be dismissed either. It is necessary to be honest here. There is no single definitive, concrete, documented proof that establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that the match was fixed. What exists is a collection of circumstances, declarations, contexts, and coincidences that, taken together, form a narrative that is difficult to ignore for anyone who takes the trouble to dive deep into the history. And that tension, that gray zone between what can be proven and what seems obvious, is precisely what makes this episode so disturbing to this day. Because if it was fixed, it was not just a football match that was manipulated. It was the entire World Cup that was tainted. It was the Argentine title of 1978 that carries, to this day, an invisible asterisk in the pages of history. It is the medal that Mario Kempes, who scored 2 goals in that match and who was the tournament's top scorer, wears with a weight that goes far beyond physical effort. Kempes is an Argentine hero, an extraordinary player. But he also plays within a context he did not choose and did not control. And that, perhaps, is the most silent tragedy of this entire story. But there is another angle that needs to be explored. The human angle. What was happening outside the stadium while inside it Argentina was scoring its 6th goal? Just a few kilometers away, detention centers were operating where political prisoners were being tortured. The ESMA, the Navy Mechanic School, was in full operation during that period. And there are testimonies from survivors who describe having heard the noise of the crowd coming from outside, the roar of thousands of people celebrating the goals, while they remained shackled in the darkness. 2 parallel realities, separated by just a few kilometers and by a moral abyss that history has never managed to close. Daniel Passarella lifted the trophy at that World Cup. All of Argentina took to the streets. And General Videla walked down to the pitch to present the trophy, using football as an instrument of legitimacy that the blood of his dictatorship's victims could never grant him. That embrace between the dictator and the champions is one of the most disturbing images in the history of world sport. Not because of the joy it captures, but because of what it conceals. The Peruvian national team never again competed in a World Cup with the same quality. Quiroga continued playing but was never the same player outside Peru. And the football world moved on, as the football world always does, carrying its secrets between the goals and the glories. What this episode teaches us, half a century later, is not only about the fragility of sport in the face of political power. It teaches us something deeper. It teaches us that when an authoritarian regime decides it needs a victory, it does not ask football whether it wants to participate. It simply uses it. And football, with all its beauty and all its power to unite peoples, becomes one more instrument in the toolbox of power. And the scoreline remained 6-0. 4 goals of difference. Not one more. Not one less. Too perfect. Too surgical. Too convenient to be only football. This story has no end. It continues every time someone opens the pages of the 1978 World Cup. Every time Mario Kempes smiles in some interview and the interviewer decides not to ask the question everyone wants to ask. Every time an Argentine fan celebrates that title with the genuine pride that any champion deserves, without knowing for certain what lies beneath that conquest. Every time a survivor of Vidila's dictatorship tries to find words to describe the sound of the crowd reaching the basements while the country celebrated outside. Football is great because it is human. And because it is human, it carries within itself everything that human beings are capable of doing, from the most beautiful to the most shadowy. The 1978 World Cup is both of those things at the same time. And perhaps that is why it never leaves our minds. If you made it this far, I want to ask you one thing. Tell me in the comments what you thought of this story. This is one of the ones that gives me chills every time I tell it, because it mixes football, politics, power, and silence in a way that very few moments in history manage to do. Also tell me where you are watching from, the city and the country, because this channel has been receiving people from all over Brazil and from many countries around the world, and I am genuinely curious to know where each of you comes from. And if you have not yet hit the like button, do it now, because it helps this channel grow and continue bringing stories like this one. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe, because there is a lot of great content coming. Oh, and one more thing. While I was researching this story, I came across a product related to the world of classic football that genuinely surprised me, something that blends nostalgia and football in a very special way. I will not spoil the surprise here, but you can check the link in the first pinned comment below the video. It is a curious recommendation, no strings attached, just for those who appreciate this connection between history and football. And before I close, sit with this. What you just watched is only the tip of the iceberg. There are stories in football that are even more surprising, even more disturbing, even more human than this one. And they are coming soon, here, on this channel. Do not miss them.